Welcome, dear viewer, to a tale that transcends time itself. Have you ever wondered what it would be like to live during America's most opulent era, when love fought against society's rigid expectations? This is the story of Catherine Morrison, a brave journalist who dared to challenge the boundaries of her time, and Edward Whitmore, a railroad magnate who discovered that true wealth lies not in gold, but in the courage to follow one's heart. Tell me, where are you watching from today? From the bustling streets of a modern city, or perhaps from the quiet countryside? Wherever you are, this story will transport you to 1878 New York. Before we begin this journey together, please subscribe to our channel and leave a like if you enjoy stories that touch the soul. Now let us step back in time. New York City, summer of 1878, the Gilded Age. The crystal chandeliers of the Breakers Mansion cast dancing shadows across marble floors polished to mirror perfection. Summer heat hung thick in the Newport air, yet inside the Vanderbilt Palace, ladies fluttered silk fans while gentlemen adjusted starched collars, all performing the elaborate ballet of high society. The year 1878 had brought unprecedented prosperity to America's elite, and tonight's ball was a testament to their golden reign. Catherine Morrison stood at the edge of the ballroom, her emerald silk gown a calculated choice that honored tradition while asserting her independence. At 23, she possessed the rare combination of beauty and intellect that made both men and women take notice, though for entirely different reasons. Her auburn hair was swept into an elegant chignon, revealing the graceful curve of her neck and the determined set of her jaw. She was here not as a guest seeking a husband, but as a journalist for the New York Herald, documenting the extravagances of America's new aristocracy. The orchestra's strings whispered Strauss melodies as couples glided across the floor in perfect synchronization. Kate observed everything through the lens of her profession, the way Mrs. Astor's diamonds caught the light, the subtle tensions between railroad dynasties, the quiet desperation of debutantes, hoping to secure advantageous matches. Her notebook, discreetly hidden in her beaded reticule, was filling with observations that would later become her column on society's glittering facade. "Might I have the pleasure of this dance?" The voice, deep and unexpectedly gentle, came from behind her. Kate turned to find herself facing Edward Whitmore, heir to one of the most influential railroad fortunes in the country. His dark hair was meticulously groomed, his evening clothes impeccable, yet there was something in his grey eyes that suggested a man weary of the performance required by his station. At 29, he carried himself with the confidence of someone born to privilege, yet Kate detected an underlying vulnerability that intrigued her professional instincts. "I'm afraid I don't dance with strangers, Mr. Whitmore," she replied, recognizing him from newspaper photographs and society pages. A smile played at the corners of his mouth. "Then allow me to remedy that. Edward Whitmore, and I have a proposition that might interest a woman of your unique position." There was something in his tone that made Kate's pulse quicken, not entirely with alarm, but with the journalist's instinct for a story. She noticed how his eyes scanned the room as if seeking escape routes, how his shoulders tensed when he spotted a particular cluster of matrons near the refreshment table. "And what position would that be, sir?" "That of a woman who observes rather than participates, who sees through the artifice to the truth beneath." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "I find myself in need of a temporary refuge from the matrimonial ambitions of certain interested parties. Perhaps you might consider a brief masquerade. Nothing compromising, merely the appearance of mutual interest." Kate studied his face, noting the genuine desperation carefully masked by breeding and charm. Around them, the waltz continued its hypnotic rhythm, while across the room she could see Mrs. Margaret Whitmore, Edward's formidable aunt, holding court with several eligible young ladies and their mothers, all eyes occasionally darting toward Edward with predatory calculation. "I suppose," Kate said slowly, "that one dance might serve both our purposes. I observe society's intricate dances, and you avoid becoming prey to them." Edward's relief was almost palpable as he offered his arm. "You understand the game perfectly." As they moved onto the dance floor, Kate felt the immediate shift in the room's attention. Whispers rustled like autumn leaves as observers tried to identify Edward Whitmore's mysterious partner. His hand at her waist was warm and steady, guiding her through the complicated steps of the cotillion with practiced ease. Despite her reservations about such deceptions, Kate found herself genuinely enjoying the sensation of floating across the polished floor, her silk skirts rustling in harmony with the music. "You're quite accomplished," Edward murmured as they navigated a particularly complex turn. "I had excellent teachers," Kate replied, then added with a hint of mischief, "though they might disapprove of my current profession." Ah, yes, the infamous lady journalist. I confess I've read your articles on the railroad expansion. Quite insightful, particularly your observations about the human cost of progress. Kate's eyebrows rose in surprise. Most men of his class dismissed her work as frivolous society prattle. You actually read the substance rather than merely glancing at the byline. I make it my business to understand all perspectives on my industry, miss. For a moment Kate hesitated. Revealing her identity could compromise her ability to observe and report objectively, yet something in Edward's manner suggested genuine interest, rather than mere social manipulation. Morrison, she said finally. Catherine Morrison. The music swelled toward its conclusion, and as the final notes faded, Edward bowed deeply while Kate curtsied with practiced grace. The applause of the assembled guests washed over them, but Kate was acutely aware of the calculating gazes still fixed upon them both. Thank you for the rescue, Miss Morrison, Edward said quietly as he escorted her from the floor. And thank you for the dance, Mr. Whitmore, though I suspect this evening's performance has raised more questions than it answered. Before Edward could respond, Kate melted back into the crowd with the skill of someone accustomed to observing from the margins. She collected her wrap and made her excuses to her hostess, leaving through the servants' entrance to avoid further scrutiny. As her hired carriage rolled away from the breakers, she found herself touching her waist, where Edward's hand had rested, wondering if she had just witnessed the beginning of something far more complex than a simple society masquerade. Behind the mansion's glowing windows, Edward watched the last of the carriages disappear into the night, his aunt's pointed questions about his mysterious partner echoing in his ears. He had the distinct feeling that Catherine Morrison was about to complicate his carefully ordered life in ways he couldn't yet imagine. The morning rain drummed against the tall windows of Delmonico's restaurant as Catherine Morrison reviewed her notes from the previous evening's ball. The elegant dining room, with its plush red velvet banquettes and gilded moldings, provided the perfect atmosphere for conducting business while maintaining the appearance of a social call. She had chosen a table positioned to observe the room's comings and goings, a habit developed through years of gathering information for her articles. The week since the Newport ball had passed quietly, filled with her usual routine of interviews with society matrons, visits to charity events, and the careful crafting of articles that revealed just enough of the truth to satisfy her editors, while avoiding the kind of scandal that could close doors permanently. She had almost convinced herself that her encounter with Edward Whitmore was merely an amusing footnote to an otherwise routine assignment. Miss Morrison, Kate looked up from her coffee to find Edward standing beside her table, hat in hand, looking both determined and slightly uncomfortable. He was impeccably dressed in a charcoal morning coat with a burgundy silk vest, but there was a tension in his posture that suggested this was not a casual social call. Mr. Whitmore, she acknowledged, setting down her pen. This is unexpected. May I? He gestured toward the empty chair across from her. Kate nodded, studying his face as he settled himself with the careful precision of a man accustomed to being observed. The maitre d'hotel appeared instantly, recognizing Edward as one of the restaurant's most valued patrons, but Edward waved him away with a distracted gesture. I hope you'll forgive the informality of this meeting, Edward began, his fingers adjusting the gold watch chain across his vest, a nervous habit Kate filed away for future reference. I found myself in need of continuing our conversation from Newport, and I took the liberty of making inquiries about your usual haunts. Inquiries? Kate's eyebrows rose. How thorough of you! A flush colored Edward's cheeks. Nothing improper, I assure you. Merely the sort of information one might gather through mutual acquaintances and careful observation. You frequent this establishment most Tuesday mornings, prefer the corner table for its view of both entrances, and take your coffee with cream but no sugar. Despite herself, Kate was impressed by his attention to detail. And what urgent matter requires such detective work, Mr. Whitmore? Edward leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice as a group of well-dressed matrons entered the restaurant, their voices carrying across the room in animated discussion of the previous evening's opera performance. I find myself in a rather delicate situation, Miss Morrison, one that requires the assistance of someone with your particular combination of intelligence, respectability, and, he paused, searching for the right word, discretion. Kate set down her coffee cup with deliberate precision. I'm listening. As you may have observed at Newport, my aunt has taken it upon herself to arrange my marital future with the same efficiency she once applied to organizing charity bazaars. The parade of eligible young ladies has become relentless, and I find myself in desperate need of a reprieve. And how exactly do you envision me providing this reprieve? Edward's fingers drummed silently against the white tablecloth. I propose a temporary arrangement. 3 months, perhaps 4. You would accompany me to necessary social functions, creating the impression of a serious courtship, while allowing both of us to pursue our respective interests without constant interference. Kate stared at him, momentarily speechless. The audacity of the proposal was breathtaking, yet she found herself considering its practical implications rather than dismissing it outright. "You're suggesting I become your pretend paramour," she said finally, keeping her voice carefully neutral. "I prefer to think of it as a mutually beneficial business arrangement," Edward replied. "You would gain unprecedented access to social circles that could significantly enhance your journalistic endeavors, while I would gain the breathing room necessary to expand my railroad interests without the constant distraction of matrimonial scheming." Kate noticed how his voice changed when he mentioned the railroad, becoming more animated, more genuinely enthusiastic. It was, she realized, the first time she had heard him speak of something with unguarded passion. "Tell me about this railroad expansion," she said, surprising him with the tangent. Edward's eyes lit up with an intensity that transformed his entire demeanor. "The Western Territories represent the greatest opportunity for growth this country has ever seen. We're on the verge of connecting markets that have never been linked, opening trade routes that could revolutionize commerce from coast to coast. But the investment required is enormous, and European backers are hesitant to commit without assurance of American stability and vision. And a stable personal life would provide that assurance." "Precisely. A man with a wife is seen as settled, reliable, committed to the future of the country rather than merely his own advancement." Edward's expression grew more serious. "The truth is, Miss Morrison, I assumed control of Whitmore Railroad under tragic circumstances. My father's sudden death 2 years ago left me responsible for not only the company's financial survival after the panic of '73, but also for the livelihoods of nearly 3,000 employees and their families." For the first time since he had approached her table, Kate heard genuine vulnerability in his voice. The weight of such responsibility at his age must be crushing, she realized, particularly when combined with society's expectations for his personal life. What would such an arrangement entail? She heard herself asking, though part of her couldn't believe she was seriously considering such an unconventional proposal. Public appearances at significant social functions, dinners, theater performances, charity events, nothing that would compromise your reputation, and nothing that would interfere with your professional obligations. In fact, I believe it would enhance them considerably. Kate considered the possibilities. Access to the inner circles of New York's most powerful families, the ability to observe their private dynamics and business dealings firsthand, the potential for stories that could establish her reputation as more than merely a society columnist. "And what compensation would you offer for these services?" she asked, her practical nature asserting itself. Edward named a sum that made Kate's pulse quicken, despite her attempts to maintain professional composure. It was more than she earned in 6 months of writing, enough to secure her independence for years to come. "There would be conditions," Kate said slowly. "I maintain complete editorial independence regarding my work, no interference with my articles or my sources, and this arrangement remains strictly professional, no expectations beyond public appearances." "Agreed," Edward replied without hesitation, "though I would ask for some discretion regarding the temporary nature of our understanding. For the arrangement to be effective, it must appear genuine to outside observers." Kate studied his face, noting the sincerity in his gray eyes and the slight tension around his mouth that suggested he was as uncertain about this proposition as she was. The rational part of her mind catalogued all the reasons why such an arrangement was dangerous to her reputation and career. But another part, the part that had driven her to pursue journalism despite her family's objections, recognized the extraordinary opportunity he was offering. 3 months, she said finally, with the understanding that either party may withdraw with 1 week's notice should circumstances change. Edward's relief was evident as he extended his hand across the table. "Agreed, Miss Morrison. I believe this arrangement will prove beneficial to us both." As Kate shook his hand, feeling the firm warmth of his grip, she wondered if she was making the wisest decision of her career or the most foolish. The rain continued its steady rhythm against the windows, and she had the strange sense that she was crossing a threshold from which there would be no easy return. "When do we begin this charade, Mr. Whitmore?" "The Metropolitan Opera is premiering Wagner's Ring Cycle Friday evening. I have a box, and the attendance will include precisely the sort of people my aunt needs to see me squiring a serious prospect." Edward's smile was both grateful and slightly mischievous. "I hope you enjoy German opera, Miss Morrison." As Edward took his leave, Kate remained at her table, staring out at the rain-soaked street and wondering what she had just agreed to. The next 3 months, she realized, were going to be far more complicated than any article she had ever written. The Metropolitan Opera House glowed like a jeweled crown against the darkening October sky as carriages deposited New York's elite beneath its grand portico. Catherine Morrison adjusted her sapphire blue silk gloves as Edward's private carriage drew to a halt, the Whitmore family crest gleaming on the door panels. She had chosen her gown carefully, a creation of midnight blue velvet with intricate beadwork that caught the gaslight, elegant enough to command respect, yet not so ostentatious as to appear nouveau riche. "Are you prepared for the performance, Miss Morrison?" Edward asked quietly, as they waited for the footman to open their door. "And I don't refer to Wagner." Kate smiled at his subtle jest. "I believe I understand my role, Mr. Whitmore, though I confess I'm curious to see how well you play yours." The past week had been spent in careful preparation for this public debut. Edward had sent flowers, tasteful arrangements of white roses and baby's breath, along with brief proper notes that could be intercepted and read by servants without causing scandal. They had taken a chaperoned drive through Central Park, maintaining appropriate distance while establishing their acquaintance in the public eye. Every gesture had been calculated to suggest a developing attachment, while remaining within the bounds of propriety. Now, as Edward handed her down from the carriage, Kate was acutely aware of the attention they commanded. Conversations paused as they passed, fans fluttered with renewed vigor, and more than one society matron leaned toward her companion to share hurried observations. Edward's hand at her elbow was steady and warm, providing unexpected comfort as they navigated the social scrutiny. The opera house's interior was magnificent, 5 tiers of red velvet and gold leaf, rising toward a painted ceiling that rivaled the grandest European theaters. The Whitmore box occupied a prime position in the first tier, offering excellent views of both the stage and the equally important social theater playing out in the opposing boxes. "Ah, Edward, there you are." Mrs. Margaret Whitmore appeared at the box entrance like a ship of war under full sail, her black silk gown adorned with enough jet beading to outfit a small boutique. Edward's aunt was a formidable woman in her 60s, who had dedicated her widowhood to managing both her own social position and her nephew's future with military precision. "Aunt Margaret," Edward rose to greet her, his smile polite but carefully controlled. "May I present Miss Catherine Morrison?" "Catherine, my aunt, Mrs. Margaret Whitmore." Kate curtsied with exactly the proper depth for the introduction, her years of observation serving her well. "Mrs. Whitmore, I'm honored to meet you. Edward has spoken of you with such affection." Margaret's sharp blue eyes assessed Kate from head to toe with the thoroughness of a horse trader evaluating stock. "Indeed! And what brings you to our acquaintance, Miss Morrison?" "I confess I don't recall your family name from the usual circles. My father is in trade," Kate replied evenly, neither apologizing for nor emphasizing their merchant-class origins. "Morrison Imports, specializing in fine Irish linens and woolens. We are hardly old money, but we're honest money." The distinction was crucial in New York society. New wealth was acceptable if earned through legitimate enterprise rather than speculation or questionable means. Margaret's expression softened slightly, though her evaluation continued. "And you write for the newspapers, I understand?" "I do. Society pieces primarily, though I occasionally venture into other subjects that interest me." Before Margaret could probe further, the orchestra began tuning their instruments, and the great curtain rose to reveal the mythic realm of Das Rheingold. As Wagner's powerful music filled the opera house, Kate found herself genuinely drawn into the drama unfolding on stage, temporarily forgetting the equally complex performance required in their box. During the first intermission, Edward guided Kate through the crush of society figures gathering in the grand foyer, making introductions with diplomatic skill. She met the wives of railroad barons, steel magnates, and shipping tycoons, women who controlled social access with the same strategic thinking their husbands applied to business. Each conversation was a careful dance of revelation and concealment, establishing her place in the hierarchy while avoiding topics that might expose the temporary nature of her arrangement with Edward. "So you're the mysterious young lady who captured our Edward's attention at Newport," remarked Mrs. Caroline Astor, the undisputed queen of New York society. Her tone was pleasant, but Kate detected the underlying assessment in her pale eyes. "I believe we captured each other's attention," Kate replied diplomatically. Mr. Whitmore is a most engaging conversationalist. Mrs. Astor's smile suggested approval of Kate's discretion. Indeed. And I understand you have insights into the railroad industry? So few young ladies concern themselves with such matters. I find the expansion westward fascinating from both an economic and human perspective, Kate said carefully. The courage required to venture into unknown territories, the vision to see connections where none existed before, it's quite remarkable. As she spoke, Kate was aware of Edward watching her with something approaching surprise. She had the sense that he hadn't expected her to display genuine knowledge of his business interests, and his impressed expression gave her an unexpected flush of satisfaction. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Cornelius Vanderbilt, Jr., his presence immediately creating a subtle shift in the group's dynamics. The railroad industry was intensely competitive, and the rivalry between the Vanderbilt and Whitmore lines was well known in business circles. Whitmore, Vanderbilt nodded coolly to Edward, then turned his attention to Kate with predatory interest. And this must be the lovely Miss Morrison I've been hearing about. Cornelius Vanderbilt, Jr., at your service. Kate accepted his bow with appropriate grace, while noting the tension that suddenly radiated from Edward. Mr. Vanderbilt, your reputation precedes you, as does yours, my dear. I understand you write with considerable insight about matters of commerce. Perhaps you'd be interested in learning about some of our exciting new developments. I'd be delighted to provide you with information that might prove illuminating. The offer was simultaneously gracious and threatening. Access to competing information that could compromise Edward's business interests, while appearing to be merely friendly professional interest. How kind of you, Kate replied smoothly, though I find my current perspective quite comprehensive. Edward has been most generous in sharing his expertise. Vanderbilt's smile remained charming, but his eyes hardened slightly. Of course, though one mustn't limit oneself to a single source, however knowledgeable. The railroad business is complex with many competing interests and perspectives. The warning was delicately delivered but unmistakable. Kate felt Edward's tension increase, though his exterior remained perfectly composed. Indeed, Kate said pleasantly. I've found that the most interesting stories often emerge from understanding those complexities rather than simplifying them. The second bell chimed, signaling the end of intermission and providing a graceful escape from the increasingly pointed conversation. As they returned to their box, Edward's hand at her back conveyed both gratitude and concern. I apologize for Vanderbilt's behavior, he murmured as they settled into their seats. Business rivalries sometimes spill over into social situations inappropriately. No apology necessary, Kate replied quietly. Though I begin to understand why you feel the need for allies in your personal life. The business world appears quite ruthless. As the curtain rose on de Walcure, Kate found herself studying Edward's profile in the dim light, noting the tension in his jaw and the protective way he positioned himself between her and the Vanderbilt box. Whatever had begun as a simple business arrangement between them was already becoming more complicated. Entangled with genuine emotions and real dangers she was only beginning to understand. The final notes of Wagner's epic rang through the opera house as the curtain fell, and the audience rose in thunderous applause. As Edward helped Kate with her wrap, she caught sight of Margaret Whitmore watching them with calculating eyes, and she realized that their performance had been successful enough to advance to the next act of their own complicated drama. I believe, Edward said quietly as they made their way toward the exit, that this evening has achieved its intended purpose. Kate nodded, though she suspected the evening's true significance lay not in the impression they had created for others, but in the subtle shifts occurring within their own carefully maintained boundaries. As their carriage rolled through the gaslit streets toward her boarding house, she found herself wondering which performance had been more compelling, Wagner's mythic tale of gods and mortals, or the beginning of their own complex masquerade. The Steinway grand piano dominated the music room of the Whitmore mansion like a sleeping giant, its ebony surface reflecting the dancing flames from the marble fireplace. November rain pelted the tall windows overlooking Fifth Avenue as Catherine Morrison stood beside the instrument, her fingertips tracing its polished edge with unconscious reverence. The room itself was a shrine to musical sophistication. Persian carpets muffled footsteps, velvet drapes in deep burgundy framed the windows, and oil paintings of European concert halls lined the walls. "Do you play?" Edward's voice came from the doorway, where he had been silently observing her communion with the piano. Kate started slightly, then smiled with genuine pleasure. "I did once upon a time," though I fear my skills have grown rusty from neglect. Please, Edward gestured toward the bench. I'd be honored to hear you attempt something. Kate hesitated, then settled onto the tufted velvet bench, her burgundy wool dress spreading gracefully around her. Her fingers found the keys tentatively, picking out the opening notes of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. The melody emerged hesitantly at first, then gained confidence as muscle memory reasserted itself, filling the room with the composer's bittersweet harmonies. Edward moved to stand where he could see her hands on the keys, noting the way her expression softened as she lost herself in the music. There was something almost sacred about watching her play, a glimpse of the woman beneath the careful professional facade she maintained. "My mother played that piece," he said quietly when the last notes faded into silence. Kate's hands stilled on the keys. "Tell me about her." Edward moved to the window, gazing out at the rain-swept street. Eleanor Whitmore was considered one of Boston's most accomplished young ladies when my father met her. She had studied in Vienna, spoke 4 languages, and could discuss literature with the same facility she brought to mathematics. But what captured my father's heart was her playing. He said she could make the piano weep or laugh at will. "When did she die?" Kate asked gently, sensing the weight of old grief in his posture. "The cholera epidemic of 1854. I was 6. Edward's reflection in the window glass looked younger, more vulnerable. "She insisted on nursing the sick in our ward, despite my father's protests. Said that privilege carried the obligation to serve those less fortunate." Kate rose from the piano bench and joined him at the window, close enough to offer comfort without presuming intimacy. "She sounds remarkable. You must miss her terribly." "Every day," Edward admitted, "particularly when I face decisions she would have handled with such wisdom. Sometimes I play her favorite pieces, hoping to hear her guidance in the music." They stood in comfortable silence, watching carriages splash through puddles on the avenue below. The intimacy of the moment felt both natural and dangerous, a departure from their carefully maintained professional distance. "What about your mother?" Edward asked eventually. "You've never mentioned her." Kate's smile grew wistful. Bridget O'Sullivan Morrison was as Irish as the Emerald Isle itself, complete with red hair, green eyes, and a temper that could wither flowers at 20 paces. She came to New York with nothing but a fierce determination to make something of herself. "How did she meet your father?" "He was importing linens from Ireland and needed someone who could verify the quality and authenticity of the goods. Bridget had worked in the textile mills of Belfast and knew fabrics like a vintner knows wine." Kate's voice warmed with affection. "Father said he fell in love watching her examine a bolt of linen, the way her eyes lit up when she found the perfect weave, how gently she handled the fabric as if it were alive, and she approved of your unconventional career." Kate laughed, a sound full of genuine amusement. "Mother would have boxed my ears for limiting myself to writing about society parties. She believed education was the only real security a woman could possess, and she made sure I understood that my mind was my greatest asset." "She sounds formidable." She was, but also heartbreakingly tender when she thought no one was watching. Kate's expression grew distant. "She died when I was 17. Pneumonia, caught while volunteering at the immigrant hospital. Like your mother, she believed wealth brought responsibility." Edward turned from the window to study Kate's profile, noting the way candlelight caught the auburn highlights in her carefully arranged hair. "Is that why you became a journalist? To help people?" "Partly, but also because I'm naturally curious about what lies beneath the surface of things. Society presents such a polished facade, but the real stories happen in the spaces between the official version and the truth. The observation hung in the air between them, charged with implications about their own carefully constructed facade." Edward stepped closer, his voice dropping to an intimate register. "And what story do you see in the space between our official version and the truth, Miss Morrison?" Kate felt her pulse quicken at his proximity, the warmth radiating from his body, the subtle scent of his cologne mixing with the smoke from the fireplace. For a moment, the careful boundaries of their arrangement seemed as fragile as morning mist. "I see 2 people who understand the weight of responsibility, the loneliness of carrying others' expectations," she said quietly. "2 people who perhaps recognize kindred spirits in each other." Edward's hand rose to almost touch her cheek, then fell away as propriety reasserted itself. "I confess that our arrangement has become more complex than I anticipated." Before Kate could respond, the sound of the front door opening echoed through the mansion, followed by voices in the foyer. Edward stepped back quickly, running a hand through his hair to restore his composure. "Edward, are you entertaining? I saw the lights in the music room." Margaret Whitmore's voice carried authority, even when making polite inquiry. "Merely showing Miss Morrison the piano collection, Aunt Margaret. Edward replied, moving to open the music room door. Catherine was kind enough to play for me. Margaret appeared in the doorway, her sharp eyes taking in Kate's slightly flushed cheeks and Edward's defensive posture. How delightful! I do hope you'll play for us again soon, Miss Morrison. Music reveals so much about a person's character. The comment carried subtle warning that Margaret was observing and assessing every interaction between her nephew and his supposed paramour. Kate smiled politely, while noting the older woman's strategic positioning to monitor their behavior. Perhaps we should arrange an evening of music, Kate suggested diplomatically. I'd love to hear more about Mrs. Whitmore's musical preferences. As they moved toward the main hall, Edward caught Kate's arm gently. Might I call on you tomorrow? There's something I'd like to discuss privately. Kate nodded, though she wondered what new complications their deepening acquaintance might bring. As her carriage carried her through the gaslit streets toward her modest boarding house, she reflected on the evening's revelations. What had begun as a simple business arrangement was evolving into something far more complex, a genuine connection that threatened to breach all the careful boundaries they had established. The rain continued its steady rhythm against the carriage windows, and Kate found herself humming the Chopin nocturne, her mother's voice echoing in her memory. Never settle for the surface of things, darling. The most beautiful treasures are always found in the depths. As her boarding house came into view, Kate realized she was about to discover just how deep those waters could become. The Whitmore estate in Albany rose from the banks of the Hudson River like something from a European fairy tale, its Gothic revival towers and gabled roofs softened by the golden light of late afternoon. November had painted the surrounding hills in shades of amber and crimson, and the river below reflected the sky like polished pewter. Catherine Morrison stood on the mansion's stone terrace, her dark green traveling suit a striking contrast against the limestone balustrade, watching steam rise from the water, where the autumn air met the warmer current. The journey from Manhattan had taken most of the day on Edward's private railroad car, a conveyance that spoke of understated luxury rather than ostentatious display. They had traveled in the company of Mrs. Elizabeth Whitmore, Edward's widowed sister, whose presence provided necessary propriety while allowing Kate to observe the family dynamics that shaped Edward's world. The river is magnificent at this time of year, came a cultured voice from behind her. Kate turned to find Elizabeth approaching, carrying a tea service on a silver tray. At 31, Elizabeth possessed the same dark hair and grey eyes as her brother, but where Edward often seemed burdened by responsibility, she radiated a calm competence that spoke of someone who had found peace with her circumstances. It's breathtaking, Kate agreed, accepting a delicate porcelain cup. I can understand why your family chose to build here. Our great-grandfather was a romantic, Elizabeth said with a gentle smile. He believed that surrounding oneself with beauty made one a better person, though I suspect he also appreciated the practical advantages of controlling river traffic for his shipping interests. Kate sipped her tea, noting the subtle blend of pragmatism and sentiment in Elizabeth's observation. You manage the estate, Edward mentioned? Among other things, after my husband died at Gettysburg, I found myself with time and a talent for organization that Edward desperately needed. The railroad business requires constant attention, but someone must also tend to the properties, the investments, the 100 details that keep a family enterprise functioning. There was no self-pity in Elizabeth's tone, merely the matter-of-fact acceptance of someone who had turned personal tragedy into useful purpose. Kate found herself warming to this woman, who seemed to combine practical intelligence with genuine kindness. It must be rewarding work, Kate observed, most of the time. Though I confess I worry about Edward. He assumed responsibilities so young, and he takes every setback, every employee's welfare, so personally. Elizabeth's gaze found her brother's figure in the gardens below, where he was walking with the estate manager, discussing winter preparations. I sometimes think he forgets that he's entitled to personal happiness as well as professional success. The comment carried subtle inquiry about Kate's intentions, delivered with enough delicacy to avoid offense while making the concern clear. Kate chose her words carefully. He strikes me as a man who believes happiness must be earned rather than simply pursued. Precisely. Which is why I'm so pleased to see him, relaxing somewhat in your company. He laughs more frequently, seems less burdened by constant calculation. Elizabeth turned to study Kate directly. I hope you don't mind my speaking plainly, but Edward has had precious little joy in his life. I'd hate to see him disappointed if your interest proves temporary. The warning was delivered with such gentle kindness that Kate felt a stab of guilt about the deception she was helping to maintain. Elizabeth clearly cared deeply for her brother's well-being, and Kate found herself wishing she could explain the true nature of their arrangement, while knowing such honesty was impossible. "I value Edward's friendship greatly," Kate said carefully, "and I would never wish to cause him pain." "Of course not. Forgive me for speaking so directly. It's just that Edward had such plans before father died. He wanted to study engineering at Harvard, had ideas about designing more efficient rail systems, improving safety for workers. Instead, he had to abandon those dreams to save the company. After the panic of '73, Kate absorbed this information with professional interest while feeling genuine sympathy for the personal sacrifice it represented. How many of Edward's generation had been forced to set aside their aspirations for the demands of family duty? He mentioned the business difficulties briefly. Kate said, "It must have been a challenging transition." "Devastating." Edward was 27, with a young man's ideals about reforming business practices to benefit workers as well as shareholders. Instead, he found himself forced to make brutal decisions about wages and employment just to keep the company solvent. I think part of him still grieves for the man he might have been. Their conversation was interrupted by Edward's return from the gardens, his cheeks reddened by the cool air and his eyes bright with something approaching contentment. Kate felt her pulse quicken at his smile, an involuntary response that troubled her with its authenticity. "I hope Elizabeth hasn't been sharing embarrassing childhood stories," he said, joining them at the balustrade. "Only the most flattering ones," Elizabeth replied with sisterly mischief. "I was just telling Catherine about your engineering interests." Edward's expression grew wistful. "Ancient history, I'm afraid, though I confess I still find myself sketching track configurations and bridge designs in the margins of business correspondence." "Perhaps those interests aren't as ancient as you think," Kate suggested gently. "The Western expansion requires considerable engineering innovation, doesn't it?" "Indeed it does." Edward's enthusiasm broke through his customary reserve. "The challenges are extraordinary, crossing desert terrain, navigating mountain passes, bridging rivers that flood unpredictably. It requires both vision and practical problem-solving on a scale never before attempted." As he spoke, Kate saw the man Elizabeth had described, someone who found genuine excitement in technical challenges and creative solutions. The transformation in his manner was remarkable, and she realized how carefully he usually suppressed this aspect of his personality in favor of the dignified businessman persona his position required. "You should show Catherine the workshop," Elizabeth suggested. "I think she'd appreciate your mechanical innovations." Edward looked uncertain. "I wouldn't want to bore you with technical details." "On the contrary," Kate said with genuine interest, "I'd love to see what you've been working on." The workshop occupied a converted carriage house behind the main mansion, its interior filled with detailed drawings, scale models, and the tools of precision craftsmanship. Kate moved through the space with fascination, noting the careful attention to both efficiency and worker safety in Edward's designs. "This is remarkable," she said, studying a model of an improved coupling system. "You've solved the safety problem that causes so many injuries in the rail yards." Edward's face lit up with pleasure at her understanding. "Exactly. The current manual coupling requires workers to stand between cars while they're moving. It's barbaric. This design would allow coupling from the side, reducing accidents significantly." As he explained the mechanics, Kate found herself genuinely absorbed in both the technical innovation and the humanitarian motivation behind it. This was the Edward Whitmore that Elizabeth remembered. Passionate, idealistic, driven by more than mere profit. "Why haven't you implemented these improvements?" Kate asked. Edward's enthusiasm dimmed slightly. "Cost, primarily. Retrofitting existing equipment requires substantial investment, and the board is reluctant to spend money on worker safety when current methods, however dangerous, are functional and familiar. But surely the long-term savings in medical costs and litigation would justify the expense." "You'd think so, but boards of directors often focus on quarterly profits rather than long-term benefits." Edward's frustration was evident. "Sometimes I think the only way to implement real improvements would be to build an entirely new line from scratch, designed according to modern principles rather than inherited limitations." Kate heard the longing in his voice, the dream of creating something better than what already existed. She also heard the practical constraints that made such dreams difficult to pursue. As they walked back toward the mansion in the gathering dusk, Kate found herself studying Edward's profile in the lamplight spilling from the windows. The man she was discovering bore little resemblance to the reserved businessman she had first encountered. This Edward was passionate, idealistic, burdened by responsibilities but not broken by them. "Thank you for sharing your work with me," she said quietly. "I understand now why Elizabeth is so proud of you." Edward stopped walking, turning to face her in the shadow of the rose arbor. "And I'm beginning to understand why I find myself confiding in you in ways I never intended." The admission hung in the air between them, charged with implications that threatened the careful boundaries of their arrangement. Kate felt the pull of genuine attraction, not just to his obvious qualities, but to the complex man she was discovering beneath the surface. "Edward," she began, then stopped, uncertain how to voice the confusion of feelings their deepening acquaintance was creating. He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the struggle in his grey eyes, the tension between desire and propriety. "I know," he said quietly. "This wasn't supposed to become complicated?" Kate supplied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Real," Edward corrected, his hand rising to almost touch her cheek before falling away. "Our arrangement was meant to be a simple business transaction. Instead, I find myself caring." The word escaped before Kate could stop it, revealing more of her own feelings than she had intended. Edward's smile was rueful, far more than is wise given our circumstances. The sound of Elizabeth calling them for dinner provided a necessary interruption, breaking the spell of intimacy that had settled around them. As they walked toward the mansion's welcoming lights, Kate realized that their carefully constructed facade was giving way to something far more dangerous, the possibility of genuine love, with all its complications and potential for heartbreak. The Hudson River continued its ancient flow toward the sea, indifferent to human complications, while in the mansion above, three people prepared to navigate the treacherous waters of truth and deception that would determine all their futures. The newsroom of the New York Herald buzzed with its usual chaotic energy as Catherine Morrison made her way between the cluttered desks toward the editor's office. The December morning was gray and bitter, with snow threatening in the low-hanging clouds that pressed against Manhattan's rooftops. The air inside was thick with tobacco smoke and the sharp scent of printer's ink, while the constant clatter of typewriters provided a staccato rhythm to the journalists' urgent conversations. James O'Brien's office occupied a corner of the building, its windows offering a view of the busy street below, where vendors hawked newspapers and office workers hurried past with their collars turned up against the wind. O'Brien himself was a man of middle years, whose Irish heritage showed in his ruddy complexion and steel-grey hair, but whose American ambition burned in his keen blue eyes. He had built the Herald's reputation through a combination of thorough reporting and strategic discretion that kept both readers and advertisers satisfied. "Sit down, Kate," O'Brien said without preamble as she entered his office. His tone was serious, lacking the usual warmth he showed toward his most reliable society correspondent. "We need to discuss your recent articles." Kate settled into the worn leather chair across from his desk, noting the stack of newspapers and correspondence that suggested he had been conducting research. Her professional instincts sharpened as she recognized the signs of an editor preparing for a difficult conversation. "Is there a problem with my work?" she asked, maintaining the calm tone that had served her well in countless interviews with defensive socialites. "On the contrary, your work has been exceptional." Too exceptional, perhaps. O'Brien leaned back in his chair, studying her with the intensity of someone trying to solve a complex puzzle. "Your recent pieces on railroad expansion show remarkable insight into business strategies and financial projections. Insights that seem quite beyond what one might gather from public speeches and social gatherings." Kate felt a chill that had nothing to do with the December weather. "I pride myself on thorough research, Mr. O'Brien. I read industry publications, attend lectures, interview knowledgeable sources." "Indeed, and one of those sources appears to be Edward Whitmore himself." O'Brien's tone remained carefully neutral, but Kate detected the underlying concern. "I've been hearing interesting reports about your frequent appearances at his side." "Mr. Whitmore has been gracious enough to educate me about the railroad industry," Kate replied carefully, "as have several other prominent businessmen. I believe in understanding my subjects thoroughly." O'Brien opened a folder on his desk and withdrew several newspaper clippings. "These are from various society columns over the past 6 weeks. Each mentions you as Edward Whitmore's frequent companion. The speculation about your relationship has become quite prominent." Kate reviewed the clippings with growing unease. What she had hoped would appear as casual social acquaintance was being interpreted as serious courtship, complete with breathless speculation about engagement announcements and wedding plans. "Society columnists are prone to exaggeration," she said, though she knew the excuse sounded weak even to her own ears. "Perhaps. But my concern isn't gossip, Kate. It's the appearance of conflict of interest." O'Brien's expression grew more serious. If you're romantically involved with Whitmore, how can readers trust your objectivity when writing about railroad business? More importantly, how can I trust that you're not sharing confidential information that could affect stock prices or business negotiations? The accusation struck Kate like a physical blow. Her professional integrity was the foundation of everything she had worked to build, and the suggestion that she might compromise it for personal gain made her stomach clench with anger and fear. "I have never shared confidential information," she said firmly, "and I have never allowed personal feelings to compromise my professional judgment." "I want to believe that, Kate, but I also have to protect the newspaper's reputation." O'Brien withdrew another document from his folder. "This came to my attention yesterday. Perhaps you can explain it." Kate looked at the paper with growing dread. It was a detailed analysis of Whitmore Railroad's financial position, including information about loan negotiations and expansion plans that she recognized from conversations with Edward, conversations that had taken place in private moments when his guard was down. "Where did you get this?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Thomas McKenna, a former clerk with Whitmore Railroad, brought it to us. He claims there are serious irregularities in the company's financial records. Falsified contracts, inflated assets, questionable loans from the First National Bank. He's offering to provide documentation in exchange for protection and a substantial fee." Kate's mind raced as she processed the implications. If McKenna's allegations were true, Edward could be facing criminal charges. If they were false, someone was attempting to destroy his reputation and business through manufactured scandal. Either way, her position as both his supposed paramour and the journalist investigating the story created an impossible conflict. "What do you want me to do?" she asked, though she dreaded the answer. "I want you to investigate these allegations thoroughly and objectively, and I want you to end whatever personal involvement you have with Whitmore until the investigation is complete." O'Brien's tone brooked no argument. "The Herald's credibility depends on our ability to report the truth without bias. If you can't maintain that objectivity, I'll assign the story to someone else." Kate stared at the documents scattered across O'Brien's desk, feeling the careful structure of her life beginning to collapse. The arrangement with Edward had become far more complex than a simple business transaction, involving genuine feelings that made objective reporting nearly impossible. Yet her career and reputation depended on her ability to separate personal emotions from professional duty. "I'll conduct a thorough investigation," she said finally, "but I'll need access to company records and the right to interview all relevant parties." "Agreed. But Kate," O'Brien's voice softened slightly, "be careful. Railroad money is powerful, and people who threaten those interests sometimes find themselves facing serious consequences. If Whitmore is innocent, he'll want the truth revealed. If he's guilty..." The unfinished sentence hung in the air like a threat. Kate gathered the documents with hands that trembled slightly, her mind already formulating plans for an investigation that could destroy everything she had come to value. As she left O'Brien's office, the newsroom's familiar chaos seemed muted, as if she were viewing it through glass. Her carefully constructed world was about to collide with the harsh realities of business and politics, and she wasn't certain which would survive the impact. The snow had begun to fall as she emerged onto the street, each flake a cold reminder of the winter that was descending on more than just the city. By tomorrow, she would have to begin asking Edward questions that would reveal either his innocence or his guilt, and in either case, would probably end the relationship that had become far more precious to her than any mere professional arrangement had a right to be. As her carriage carried her through the grey streets toward her boarding house, Kate found herself wondering if the truth was always worth the price it demanded, and whether some secrets were better left buried beneath the pristine snow that was beginning to cover the sins of the city. The Hoffman House Hotel's private dining room glowed with subdued elegance. As Catherine Morrison waited for Edward's arrival, her hands folded carefully in her lap to hide their trembling. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over mahogany furnishings and Persian carpets, creating an atmosphere of intimacy that now felt more like a trap than a refuge. The past week had been torture, maintaining their public appearances while privately agonizing over the investigation she was conducting into his business affairs. Edward arrived precisely on time, as was his habit, but Kate immediately noticed the tension in his posture and the slight shadows beneath his eyes that suggested sleepless nights. He moved with his usual grace, yet there was something guarded in his manner that made her wonder if he had somehow learned of her investigation. "Catherine," he said warmly, taking her hand and pressing a brief kiss to her gloved fingers. "You look lovely, though perhaps a bit pale. I hope you haven't been working too hard." The irony of his concern struck her like a physical blow. If only he knew that her recent exhaustion came from researching his potential criminal activities, rather than any ordinary journalistic assignment. "I've been busy with a complex story," she replied, the half-truth bitter on her tongue. "But I wanted to see you. It feels like we've had so little time alone lately." Edward signaled the waiter to pour wine, his movements automatic as he studied Kate's face with the attention of someone who had learned to read nuanced communications in business negotiations. "Indeed, the past few weeks have been challenging on several fronts." His tone remained conversational, but Kate detected an undercurrent of strain. "I sometimes think the railroad business attracts more than its fair share of controversy and speculation." Kate's pulse quickened. Was he referring to her investigation? Had someone warned him that a Herald reporter was asking questions about Whitmore Railroad's financial practices? "Controversy how?" she asked carefully, sipping her wine to buy time while she formulated her approach. "Rumors, mostly. Competitors spreading doubt about our financial stability, former employees making wild accusations when their own incompetence leads to dismissal." Edward's laugh was forced. "The usual business of business, though it becomes wearing after a while." The mention of former employees made Kate's stomach clench. Thomas McKenna had been quite specific about his allegations, providing dates and document numbers that would be easy enough to verify. If Edward was dismissing him as merely an incompetent former worker, either McKenna was lying or Edward was. "What sort of accusations?" Kate asked, proud of how steady her voice remained despite the turmoil in her chest. Edward's eyes sharpened slightly, and for the first time since she had known him, Kate felt as though she were being evaluated as a potential threat, rather than welcomed as a trusted confidant. "Nothing of substance. Claims about irregular loans, falsified contracts, the usual allegations made by people who understand bookkeeping, but not the complexities of large-scale business operations." He paused, studying her reaction. "I hope such rumors haven't reached your professional circles. I'd hate for your association with me to create difficulties with your editorial responsibilities." The question was casual, but Kate heard the underlying concern. Edward was fishing for information about what she might know or suspect, which suggested he was aware that questions were being asked about his business practices. "I hear all sorts of rumors in my work," Kate replied diplomatically. "Most prove to be nothing more than gossip and speculation." "Of course, though I imagine your position as both journalist and—" He paused, seeming to search for the right word. "Friend creates occasional conflicts, when professional duty and personal loyalty pull in different directions." The comment was delivered gently, but it cut to the heart of Kate's current dilemma. Edward was acknowledging the impossible position she would face if forced to choose between reporting the truth and protecting someone she cared about. "I've always believed that the truth serves everyone's interests in the long run," Kate said quietly. "Even when it's temporarily painful." Edward nodded slowly, his grey eyes reflecting what might have been approval or resignation. "A noble philosophy. Though I confess there are times when the truth can be complex, when facts can be presented in ways that support entirely different narratives." "Are you suggesting that truth is relative, Mr. Whitmore?" The formality of his name created a subtle distance between them, and Edward noticed immediately. His expression grew more serious as he leaned forward slightly. "I'm suggesting that context matters, Catherine. That good people can make decisions that appear questionable when viewed without understanding the full circumstances that necessitated them." Kate felt as though they were engaged in an elaborate dance, each testing the other's knowledge and intentions, without making direct accusations or admissions. The conversation was both intimate and adversarial, fraught with implications that neither dared voice directly. "And what circumstances might justify questionable decisions?" she asked. Edward was quiet for a long moment, his fingers turning the stem of his wineglass with mechanical precision. When he spoke, his voice carried a weariness that made him seem older than his 29 years. "Suppose a company faced bankruptcy due to circumstances beyond its control, a financial panic that destroyed credit markets, competitors who used political connections to secure advantageous legislation, a board of directors more concerned with immediate profits than long-term stability. Suppose the only way to save thousands of jobs and honor commitments to investors was to be creative with financial presentations while working toward genuine solutions." The hypothetical scenario was clearly not hypothetical at all, and Kate realized Edward was offering her a glimpse of the pressures and compromises that might have led to the irregularities McKenna had described. It was neither a confession nor a denial, but rather an explanation of how good intentions could lead to legally questionable actions. And if such creativity were discovered, Kate asked softly, then the man responsible would face the consequences of his choices, hoping that history would judge his motivations as well as his methods. Edward met her eyes directly. The question is whether those who discovered such creativity would consider the context before rendering judgment. Kate felt tears threatening and struggled to maintain her composure. Edward was essentially confessing to financial irregularities while asking for her understanding and discretion. He was trusting her with information that could destroy him, gambling that their relationship meant enough to her that she would choose loyalty over professional duty. "Edward," she began, then stopped, uncertain how to voice the conflict tearing at her heart. "I know," he said quietly. "I'm asking you to choose between your principles and your affections. It's unconscionable of me to put you in such a position." The admission hung between them like a chasm neither could cross. Kate realized that Edward had known about her investigation all along, had perhaps even orchestrated this conversation to force a resolution to the impossible situation they both faced. "What do you want me to do?" she whispered. Edward's smile was infinitely sad. "I want you to follow your conscience, Catherine. Whatever that requires, I'll understand and accept." The nobility of his response only made Kate's dilemma more painful. He was releasing her from any obligation to protect him, freeing her to pursue the truth, even if it destroyed him. It was exactly the sort of gesture that made her care for him more deeply, which in turn made the choice more agonizing. As they sat in the elegant dining room, surrounded by the trappings of wealth and privilege, Kate realized that some questions of truth and loyalty couldn't be resolved through conversation or compromise. Tomorrow, she would have to decide whether to publish a story that might send the man she was falling in love with to prison or suppress information that the public had a right to know. The weight of that choice settled on her shoulders like a leaden cloak as Edward signaled for the check, both of them knowing that whatever happened next would change everything between them forever. The gaslight flickered against the frosted windows of the Manhattan Records office as Catherine Morrison bent over a ledger that might contain the evidence to destroy or exonerate Edward Whitmore. 3 days had passed since their devastating conversation at the Hoffman house, and Kate had thrown herself into investigation with the desperate energy of someone hoping facts might provide clarity where emotions offered only confusion. Thomas McKenna sat across from her in the cramped office, his nervous energy evident in the way he constantly adjusted his spectacles and smoothed his thinning hair. At 45, he possessed the pale complexion and ink-stained fingers of someone who had spent his life bent over account books, but his eyes held the fervor of a man convinced he was serving a righteous cause. "You see here," McKenna pointed to a series of entries with a trembling finger. "These payments to Pacific Construction are listed as legitimate expenses for track laying in Nevada territory. But if you compare the dates with the actual construction reports," he withdrew another document from his leather satchel, "the payments preceded the work by nearly 6 months." Kate studied the discrepancies with growing unease. The evidence was damning, clear indication that money had been moved to create the appearance of legitimate expenses while actually serving other purposes. Yet something about McKenna's presentation troubled her professional instincts. "How did you gain access to these construction reports?" she asked carefully. McKenna's eyes shifted slightly. "I maintained contacts within the company after my departure, people who share my concerns about irregular practices. And why did you leave Whitmore Railroad's employment?" "Philosophical differences about financial transparency," McKenna replied, though his tone suggested there might be more to the story. Kate made careful notes while continuing to study the documents. The evidence appeared solid, yet years of journalism had taught her to examine not just what was presented, but what might be missing from the narrative. "Mr. McKenna, I need to ask you directly, have you been approached by anyone outside Whitmore Railroad about these allegations? Competitors, perhaps, or other interested parties?" McKenna's discomfort was immediate and obvious. "I don't see how that's relevant. The facts speak for themselves. The facts need context to be properly understood. If you're being compensated by Whitmore's business rivals, that's information readers deserve to know. My motivations are irrelevant if the evidence is authentic," McKenna protested, but his evasiveness only strengthened Kate's suspicions. Before she could probe further, a new voice interrupted their conversation. "Miss Morrison, I believe you're investigating matters related to Whitmore Railroad." Kate turned to find a man of perhaps 50 years standing in the office doorway, his expensive clothing and confident bearing marking him as someone accustomed to authority. His appearance was distinguished: silver hair, keen blue eyes, and features that suggested both intelligence and ruthlessness. "I am, and you are, William Hayes, Vice President of Operations for Whitmore Railroad. I understand Mr. McKenna has been sharing certain allegations with you." McKenna's face had gone white at Hayes's appearance, and Kate noticed how he began gathering his documents with obvious haste. "Mr. McKenna was providing background information for a story," Kate said carefully, her journalistic instincts alert to the tension suddenly filling the small office. "I see. And has he mentioned his own role in the irregularities he's so eager to expose?" Hayes stepped into the room, his presence immediately dominating the space. "Or his current employment with Cornelius Vanderbilt Jr.'s organization." The revelation struck Kate like a physical blow. If McKenna was working for Vanderbilt, his allegations took on an entirely different character, from whistleblowing to industrial sabotage designed to destroy a competitor. "Is this true?" Kate demanded, turning to McKenna. "My current employment doesn't invalidate the evidence," McKenna stammered, but his credibility was clearly shattered. Hayes smiled with grim satisfaction. Mr. McKenna was dismissed from Whitmore Railroad for embezzling funds from employee pension accounts. The irregularities he's describing weren't authorized by Mr. Whitmore. They were McKenna's own attempts to cover his theft. Kate felt the careful structure of her investigation collapsing as she realized she had been manipulated by competing business interests. Yet Hayes's version of events also needed scrutiny. "Do you have documentation supporting these claims, Mr. Hayes?" "Indeed I do." Hayes produced a folder from his briefcase. Bank records showing unauthorized withdrawals from pension funds, McKenna's signed confession when confronted with the evidence, and the agreement we reached to avoid criminal prosecution in exchange for his resignation. As Kate reviewed the documents, she began to understand the true complexity of the situation. McKenna had been stealing from worker pension funds, then attempting to cover his tracks by falsifying company records. When discovered, he had been quietly dismissed rather than prosecuted, a decision that might have been merciful, but also provided Vanderbilt with a compromised former employee who could be used to spread damaging allegations. "Why wasn't this reported to the authorities?" Kate asked Hayes. Mr. Whitmore believed prosecution would harm McKenna's family while failing to recover the stolen funds. "Sometimes mercy proves to be a mistake." Hayes's tone suggested he had disagreed with Edward's decision at the time. Kate stared at the documents spread across the desk, realizing that her investigation had uncovered a web of competing interests rather than simple corruption. McKenna was a thief being used by Vanderbilt to spread false accusations. Hayes was defending his company, but possibly concealing other irregularities. And Edward remained an enigma, whose motivations she was only beginning to understand. "I'll need to verify all of this independently," Kate said finally. "Of course," Hayes agreed. "Though I should mention that Mr. Whitmore is unaware of my presence here today. I took it upon myself to provide clarification when I learned of McKenna's activities." The revelation added another layer of complexity. If Edward didn't know about Hayes's intervention, it suggested either admirable delegation of authority or dangerous ignorance of his company's defensive measures. As McKenna fled the office with the tattered remains of his credibility, Kate found herself alone with Hayes and a new set of questions that seemed to multiply rather than resolve her dilemmas. "Mr. Hayes, I need your honest assessment of Whitmore Railroad's financial practices. Are there irregularities beyond McKenna's embezzlement?" Hayes studied her for a long moment before responding. "Miss Morrison, the railroad business operates in a complex environment of government contracts, competitive pressures, and financial requirements that don't always fit neatly into standard accounting practices. Mr. Whitmore is an honest man, trying to build something worthwhile in a dishonest world." It was, Kate realized, neither confirmation nor denial, but rather an acknowledgement that truth in business was rarely as simple as right versus wrong. As she gathered her notes and prepared to leave the records office, she understood that her investigation had revealed not corruption, but the impossible moral compromises required to survive in America's new industrial economy. The gaslight continued its steady glow as Kate stepped into the December evening, carrying with her the weight of knowledge that would force her to choose not between truth and falsehood, but between competing versions of a truth too complex for any newspaper story to capture completely. Tomorrow she would have to decide which version of that truth served the greater good, and whether her personal feelings for Edward Whitmore should play any role in that decision. The morning mist rose from the Hudson River, like the breath of sleeping giants, as Catherine Morrison's carriage raced through the grey dawn toward Weehawken Palisades. Her heart hammered against her ribs with each jolt of the wheels over rutted roads, while her mind reeled with the implications of the message she had received less than an hour earlier. Edward Whitmore was about to engage in a duel with William Hayes, and she might be the only person positioned to prevent a tragedy that would destroy multiple lives. The message had come through Elizabeth Whitmore's private courier, delivered to Kate's boarding house with urgent discretion. Elizabeth's hastily scrawled note explained that Hayes had challenged Edward after discovering his own embezzlement of company funds had been exposed, and that Edward, bound by honor and legal necessity, had accepted the challenge rather than face accusations of cowardice, in addition to the business difficulties Hayes's theft had created. Kate pressed her face to the carriage window, straining to see through the early morning fog that shrouded the New Jersey riverbank. Somewhere ahead, two men were preparing to settle their dispute with pistols in a ritual that belonged to an earlier, more barbaric age, yet one that still held terrible power over men's concepts of honor and reputation. The irony was bitter. Her investigation had led to Hayes's exposure as the true embezzler, vindicating Edward of McKenna's false accusations. But Hayes, faced with inevitable criminal prosecution and social disgrace, had chosen to drag Edward into a confrontation that could result in death or scandal regardless of the outcome. If Edward was killed, Hayes would face murder charges but would have his revenge. If Hayes died, Edward would be branded a killer despite his innocence of the original financial crimes. Kate's carriage rounded a bend in the river road, and she caught sight of two small groups of men gathered on a flat stretch of ground near the water's edge. Even at this distance, she could identify Edward by his tall, straight posture and the dark coat he had worn to their last meeting. The sight of him standing calmly while others made preparations for potential violence sent a stab of terror through her chest. "Stop here," she called to her driver, not wanting the carriage's approach to distract the participants at a crucial moment. Kate gathered her skirts and ran across the uneven ground, her boots slipping on frost-slicked grass as she approached the scene. Dr. Harrison Wells, Edward's physician, stood with a leather medical bag at his feet, his face grave with the knowledge of what wounds dueling pistols could inflict. Nearby, Hayes's second checked the loading of two ornate firearms, while Hayes himself paced nervously, his earlier bravado replaced by the reality of facing a man known for his skill with pistols. "Edward!" Kate called, her voice carrying across the misty field. He turned at the sound, his face registering surprise and concern at her unexpected presence. In 3 quick strides, he reached her side, his hands gripping her shoulders with gentle firmness. "Catherine, you shouldn't be here. This is neither safe nor appropriate for a lady to witness. And it's neither safe nor appropriate for you to participate in," Kate replied, her voice sharp with fear and frustration. "This is madness, Edward. Hayes is trying to destroy you, because he knows his own crimes have been discovered." Edward's grey eyes reflected both appreciation for her concern and resigned determination to proceed. "My reputation and the company's integrity require that I defend against Hayes's accusations publicly. If I refuse this challenge, people will assume guilt regardless of the evidence in my favor. Let them assume what they will. Your life is worth more than the opinions of people who would judge a man's character by his willingness to kill or die, rather than by his actions and integrity." The passion in Kate's voice drew attention from the other men present, and she realized that her appearance had created an additional complication. A lady's presence at a duel was scandalous, and her obvious emotional investment in Edward's welfare would fuel gossip for months. "Miss Morrison," Hayes called from across the field, his voice carrying mock courtesy, "how thoughtful of you to bid farewell to your paramour. I hope you won't judge me too harshly for defending my honor against his slanders." The calculated cruelty of Hayes's words made Kate's temper flare, and she started toward him before Edward's restraining hand stopped her. "He wants to provoke an emotional response," Edward said quietly. "Don't give him the satisfaction." 20 paces, announced Hayes's second, a thin man with the nervous demeanor of someone who wished he were anywhere else. "The gentleman will fire simultaneously on my signal." Kate watched in horror as Edward took his position, accepting his pistol with the calm efficiency of someone who had clearly prepared for this moment. The early morning light caught the metal of the weapon, reflecting cold gleams that seemed to echo the deadly seriousness of the situation. "Edward, please," Kate whispered, though she knew he was too far away to hear. The seconds began their count, and Kate felt time slow to an agonizing crawl. At 20 paces, the men turned to face each other, their pistols raised with steady hands despite the gravity of the moment. Hayes's face was flushed with nervous energy, while Edward remained perfectly composed, his expression reflecting neither fear nor anger, but rather a sad acceptance of necessity. "Gentlemen, are you ready?" called the timekeeper. Both men nodded, their weapons gleaming in the pale light. "Fire!" The simultaneous reports of the pistols cracked across the water like thunder, sending flocks of startled birds wheeling into the grey sky. Kate's scream caught in her throat as she saw Edward stagger, his left arm dropping to his side as crimson began to stain his white shirt. Hayes remained standing for a moment, looking down at his chest with an expression of surprise before collapsing to his knees. Kate ran toward Edward, her skirts hampering her progress across the rough ground, while Dr. Wells hurried to examine Hayes's wound. Edward was still standing, his right hand pressed against his left shoulder where Hayes's bullet had found its mark. "It's not serious," Edward said as Kate reached him, though his pale complexion suggested otherwise. "The bullet passed through cleanly." Dr. Wells's grim voice carried across the field. "Mr. Hayes has been mortally wounded." The bullet pierced his lung. Kate felt a mixture of relief that Edward would survive and horror at the realization that Hayes was dying. Whatever his crimes, he was still a human being whose life was ebbing away on the cold ground, while his family remained unaware of his fate. "We need to get you to proper medical attention," Kate said, her practical nature asserting itself despite the emotional turmoil of the moment. "Agreed," Dr. Wells confirmed, having done what he could for Hayes. "The wound needs cleaning and proper bandaging to prevent infection." As Edward leaned on Kate for support while walking toward the carriages, she realized that the duel had resolved nothing while creating new complications. Hayes's death would trigger legal investigations, newspaper coverage, and social scrutiny that would overshadow any vindication of Edward's business practices. They had won the battle for truth while potentially losing the war for public opinion. The ride back to Manhattan passed in tense silence, Edward's head resting against Kate's shoulder while she monitored his breathing and watched for signs of worsening injury. The morning that had begun with deception and financial intrigue had ended with violence and death, reminding both of them that the consequences of their entangled lives extended far beyond their personal relationship. As the carriage rolled through the awakening city, Kate held Edward close and wondered whether love could survive the weight of the secrets, lies and tragedies that seemed to follow them like shadows, threatening to destroy everything they had built together. 6 weeks had passed since the grey morning at Weehawken, and the late January sun streamed through the tall windows of Edward's Fifth Avenue mansion, casting geometric patterns across the Persian carpets and mahogany furniture. Catherine Morrison sat in the blue silk chair beside his desk, watching him work with his right hand while his left arm remained in a sling, a reminder of the morning that had changed everything between them. The intervening weeks had been a whirlwind of legal proceedings, newspaper coverage, and social speculation. Hayes's death had been ruled justifiable homicide in a legal duel, but the investigation had exposed his embezzlement of company funds and vindicated Edward of the accusations that had precipitated the confrontation. Kate's articles for the Herald had carefully detailed the financial irregularities while protecting Edward's privacy wherever possible, walking the delicate line between journalistic duty and personal loyalty. "The District Attorney's Office has formally closed the investigation," Edward said, setting down a legal document with obvious relief. "All charges related to Hayes's allegations have been dismissed." Kate felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she hadn't fully realized she'd been carrying. The threat of criminal prosecution had hung over them for weeks, casting a shadow over every conversation and public appearance. "And the company's financial position?" she asked. "Recovering. Hayes's embezzlement was substantial, but the insurance policies will cover most of the losses. More importantly, the European investors have renewed their confidence now that the true facts have emerged." Edward flexed his injured shoulder carefully. "We should be able to proceed with the Western expansion on schedule." Kate studied his profile as he spoke, noting the lines of strain around his eyes that hadn't been there 3 months earlier. The duel and its aftermath had aged him, adding gravity to his manner that made him seem more like the railroad baron society expected and less like the idealistic engineer she had discovered beneath the surface. "You're not happy about it," she observed. Edward's smile was rueful. "I'm relieved, certainly. But the cost—" He gestured toward his injured arm. "Hayes is dead, his family disgraced, the company's reputation damaged despite our vindication. Success achieved through such means feels hollow. You didn't choose the confrontation, Edward. Hayes forced it when he chose theft over honesty. Perhaps. but I can't escape the feeling that a wiser man might have found a different solution. My father would have handled the situation with less violence and destruction. Kate rose from her chair and moved to stand beside his desk, close enough to see the self-doubt that undermined his surface confidence. The events of recent weeks had forced her to confront her own feelings about their relationship, moving beyond the careful professional distance she had tried to maintain. "Your father didn't face the same pressures you're dealing with," she said gently. "The business world has become more competitive, more ruthless. You've handled an impossible situation with remarkable integrity." Edward looked up at her with an expression that combined gratitude and longing. "Have I? Sometimes I wonder whether I've simply become skilled at justifying questionable decisions." The vulnerability in his voice touched something deep in Kate's chest. She had spent weeks observing him navigate the legal and social consequences of the duel, noting how he took responsibility for outcomes beyond his control while showing genuine concern for Hayes's family, despite their adversarial relationship. "Edward," she said quietly, "I need to tell you something I should have said weeks ago." He set down his pen and gave her his complete attention, perhaps sensing the shift in her tone towards something more personal than their usual careful discussions of business and current events. "When I first agreed to our arrangement, I told myself it was purely professional, a mutually beneficial business transaction with clear boundaries and defined outcomes." Kate moved closer, her hands clasped before her to hide their trembling. "But somewhere between the Metropolitan Opera and the Hudson River, between Delmonico's and this moment, I stopped pretending that my feelings were merely professional interest." Edward's breath caught, and she saw hope kindle in his grey eyes, despite his obvious effort to maintain composure. "Catherine, let me finish," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I care about you, Edward, not as a journalist observing a subject, not as a temporary companion fulfilling a contract, but as a woman who has discovered that love doesn't respect carefully drawn boundaries or rational planning." The silence that followed her confession was charged with possibilities neither had dared voice during the careful months of their public charade. Edward rose from his chair, moving slowly due to his injured arm, until he stood directly before her. "And what does that mean for us?" he asked quietly. "Our arrangement was temporary, designed to end when circumstances no longer required the pretense. Perhaps it's time to stop pretending," Kate replied, her heart hammering as she voiced what both had been thinking but neither had dared suggest. Edward's right hand rose to cup her cheek with infinite gentleness, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with reverent attention. "I've been falling in love with you since that first waltz at Newport, but I didn't dare hope you might feel the same. You're so independent, so committed to your career. Independence doesn't mean isolation, Edward. And my career matters to me precisely because it allows me to choose my own path, rather than having it chosen for me." Kate leaned into his touch, savoring the warmth and strength of his hand against her skin. "If I choose to share that path with you, it would be because I want to, not because society or family expectations require it." The distinction was crucial in an era when women's choices were severely limited by law and custom. Kate was asserting her right to choose love on her own terms, rather than having it imposed through social pressure or economic necessity. "What are you saying?" Edward asked, though his expression suggested he hoped he understood her meaning. "I'm saying that our pretense has become reality, and perhaps it's time to make that reality official." Kate's smile was both nervous and determined. "If you're asking, that is." Edward's answer came not in words but in the gentle pressure of his lips against hers, a kiss that tasted of relief and joy and the promise of a future neither had dared imagine when their carefully controlled arrangement began. When they separated, both were breathless and slightly stunned by the depth of emotion that simple contact had revealed. "Is that a yes?" Kate asked with mock seriousness. "That's a proposal," Edward replied, his voice rough with emotion. "Catherine Morrison, will you marry me? Not as part of any business arrangement or social convenience, but because I love you and can't imagine my life without you." "Yes," Kate whispered, then louder. "Yes, of course, yes." As Edward drew her close with his good arm, Kate realized that their story had moved beyond deception and scandal toward something genuine and lasting. The challenges they would face as a married couple in a rapidly changing world were real, but they would face them together, as partners who had chosen each other freely and completely. Outside the mansion's windows, New York continued its relentless pace of growth and change, but inside the quiet room where two hearts had finally spoken their truth, time seemed suspended in a moment of perfect understanding and infinite possibility. The sheep meadow in Central Park had awakened from winter's grip into a symphony of green and gold. with daffodils pushing through the warming earth and cherry trees budding in anticipation of spring's full arrival. Catherine Morrison spread the blanket with practiced efficiency, while Edward unpacked the wicker hamper that Cook had prepared for their picnic, his movements still slightly careful due to his healing shoulder, but noticeably more natural than they had been a month earlier. I can't remember the last time I simply sat in the grass without any agenda, beyond enjoying the afternoon, Edward confessed, settling beside Kate on the soft wool blanket. That's because you're constitutionally incapable of relaxation, Kate replied with fond amusement, watching him arrange the food with the same methodical precision he brought to business correspondence. Even this picnic is probably being catalogued in your mind as time that could be spent reviewing construction contracts or meeting with investors. Edward's laugh was rueful, but genuine. Guilty as charged. Though I'm learning to appreciate the value of moments that exist purely for their own sake, rather than as stepping stones toward some larger goal. Kate poured lemonade from a glass pitcher, noting how the spring light brought out the silver threads in Edward's dark hair, premature marks of the stress he had carried during their complicated courtship. At 29 he was still young, but responsibility had aged him in ways that were both admirable and slightly heartbreaking. Speaking of larger goals, Edward said, his tone shifting to something more serious, I received an interesting letter yesterday. From Harvard's engineering department. Kate's eyebrows rose. Oh? They're establishing a new program focused on railroad engineering and worker safety. The department head wondered if I might be interested in guest lecturing or perhaps endowing a scholarship program. Edward's expression mixed excitement with uncertainty. It would mean returning to the academic interests I set aside when father died. That sounds wonderful, Kate said, genuinely pleased. You light up whenever you discuss engineering problems. This could be a way to pursue those interests while still maintaining your business responsibilities. Perhaps, though it would require significant time away from day-to-day company operations. Edward studied Kate's face carefully. I wanted to discuss it with you before making any commitments. Such a program would affect our future plans as well as my present obligations. The casual reference to their shared future sent a warm flutter through Kate's chest. Their engagement had been announced in the society pages 2 weeks earlier, generating the expected flurry of congratulation calls, dinner invitations, and detailed speculation about wedding plans. Yet this quiet moment in the spring sunshine felt more genuinely romantic than any of the elaborate social celebrations. I think you should pursue it, Kate said firmly. You have knowledge and perspectives that could benefit students and the entire industry. Besides, she added with a mischievous smile, I find the prospect of being married to a Harvard lecturer rather appealing. Edward's response was interrupted by the arrival of an expensively dressed couple walking along the nearby path. Kate recognized them as Mr. and Mrs. Harrison Pemberton, prominent members of New York society, whose approval carried significant social weight. Edward, how delightful to see you looking so well, Mrs. Pemberton called, approaching their blanket, with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to inserting herself into any situation that caught her interest. Edward rose politely to greet them, helping Kate to her feet with his good arm. Mr. and Mrs. Pemberton, what a pleasant surprise. May I present my fiancée, Miss Catherine Morrison? Kate executed a perfect curtsy, drawing on years of observation to match Mrs. Pemberton's social expectations while maintaining her own sense of dignity. Of course, the famous lady journalist, Mrs. Pemberton said with the sort of smile that managed to be both welcoming and slightly patronizing. I've been reading your articles with great interest. So unusual for a woman to understand business matters with such sophistication. Thank you, Kate replied evenly. I find that business and society are more intertwined than many people realize. Understanding one requires knowledge of the other. Mr. Pemberton, a man of perhaps 60 with shrewd eyes and carefully groomed whiskers, stepped forward with obvious interest. Indeed, and I understand you're writing a book about American society. My wife mentioned hearing something about it at Mrs. Astor's luncheon. Kate exchanged a quick glance with Edward. Her book project was still in early stages, but word had apparently begun circulating through society circles, with the efficiency typical of important gossip. I'm in the research phase currently, Kate said carefully, examining how America's rapid industrial growth has shaped social customs and expectations. Fascinating, Mrs. Pemberton declared. So I do hope you'll be kind to us old families who are still learning to navigate these changing times. The comment carried subtle warning that Kate's treatment of established society would be carefully monitored and judged. It was a reminder that despite her engagement to Edward, she remained an outsider whose acceptance depended on her willingness to observe certain unwritten rules about discretion and deference. "I believe American society is creating something entirely new," Kate replied diplomatically. "Neither European aristocracy nor frontier democracy, but a unique synthesis that reflects our particular history and values." Her response seemed to satisfy the Pembertons, who made polite conversation for several more minutes before continuing their walk. As they departed, Kate noticed Mrs. Pemberton's quick, calculating glance back toward their picnic blanket, the sort of look that suggested their conversation would be repeated and analyzed at the next social gathering. "That went well," Edward observed as they settled back on their blanket, "though I suspect our engagement to marry will be dissected in drawing rooms across Manhattan before evening." "Let them dissect," Kate said with more confidence than she felt. "We know the truth of our feelings, and that's what matters." Edward reached into the picnic hamper and withdrew a small velvet box that made Kate's heart skip, despite her attempt to maintain composure. "Speaking of the truth of our feelings," he opened the box to reveal a ring that took Kate's breath away, not with ostentatious size or flashy design, but with perfect elegance. The central diamond was substantial but tasteful, surrounded by smaller stones, set in delicate platinum filigree that caught the afternoon light like captured stars. "Catherine Morrison," Edward said formally, though his voice shook slightly with emotion, "will you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Not as part of any arrangement or social convenience, but because I love you completely and want to spend my life earning your continued affection." Kate extended her left hand with fingers that trembled despite her efforts to appear calm. As Edward slipped the ring onto her finger, she felt the weight of both the precious metal and the commitment it represented. "Yes," she whispered, then louder. "Yes, Edward Whitmore, I will marry you and love you and probably argue with you about business, ethics and social responsibilities for the next 50 years. Edward's laughter was joyous, as he drew her close for a kiss that ignored the proprieties about public displays of affection. When they separated, both were breathless and slightly giddy with the realization that their long charade had evolved into genuine partnership. "When?" Edward asked, his forehead resting against hers. "Soon," Kate replied, admiring the way her ring sparkled in the spring sunshine. "I see no reason to delay when we've already waited longer than necessary." As they packed up their picnic and prepared to return to the world of social obligations and business responsibilities, Kate felt a deep sense of contentment settle over her. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together as equals, who had chosen each other freely and completely. The spring afternoon was warm with promise, and the future stretched before them like an unwritten story waiting to be filled with love, adventure, and the endless possibilities that came with two hearts beating in perfect harmony. Trinity Church rose against the June sky like a Gothic prayer rendered in stone, its spire reaching toward heaven, while its doors opened to welcome New York's most prominent families for the wedding of Edward Whitmore and Catherine Morrison. The morning air shimmered with heat and anticipation as carriages deposited elegantly dressed guests beneath the church's soaring arches, their conversations creating a buzz of excitement that rivaled the cicadas singing in nearby trees. Catherine stood before the full-length mirror in the church's bridal chamber, her wedding gown a masterpiece of ivory silk and Alençon lace that had required 3 fittings to achieve perfect elegance without ostentation. The dress reflected her personality, sophisticated and beautiful, but not so elaborate as to suggest she was trying to prove her worthiness for such an elevated match. Her mother's pearl necklace provided the perfect complement to the diamond earrings Edward had given her as a wedding gift. "You look radiant, dear," said Mrs. Elizabeth Whitmore, adjusting the final fold of Kate's cathedral-length veil. Edward's sister had taken charge of the wedding preparations with military efficiency, managing everything from floral arrangements to seating charts with the skills she had developed running the family estate. Kate smiled gratefully at Elizabeth's reflection in the mirror. "Thank you for everything, not just today's arrangements. You've made me feel welcome in ways I never expected." "Edward is my brother, but you've become my sister," Elizabeth replied simply. "That's how family works, regardless of the circumstances that bring people together." A soft knock at the chamber door announced the arrival of Kate's father, Patrick Morrison, resplendent in his finest black suit with a white rose boutonniere. At 58, he remained a handsome man whose Irish heritage showed in his red hair, now silvered at the temples, and green eyes that sparkled with paternal pride. "Are you ready, daughter?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. "Though I must say you're so beautiful that I'm half tempted to lock you away rather than give you to young Whitmore." Kate laughed, kissing his cheek carefully to avoid disturbing her cosmetics. "I think Edward might object to that plan, Papa. Besides, you raised me to make my own choices, remember?" That I did. Though I never expected you to choose quite so well." Patrick's expression grew serious. "Your mother would be proud, Kate. Not just of the match you're making, but of the woman you've become." The mention of her mother brought tears to Kate's eyes, though she blinked them back to preserve her appearance. Bridget Morrison's absence was the one shadow on an otherwise perfect day, a reminder that joy and sorrow often intertwined in ways that made life both precious and poignant. The church bells began their joyous pealing, signaling that the ceremony was about to begin. Elizabeth gathered Kate's train with practiced efficiency, while Patrick offered his arm with old-world gallantry. "Shall we go make an honest man of Edward Whitmore?" Patrick asked with paternal mischief. The sanctuary was filled to capacity with New York's elite, railroad barons, steel magnates, shipping dynasties, and the social arbiters who determined acceptable matches for such prominent families. Kate recognized faces from society pages and business columns as she processed down the aisle, their expressions ranging from genuine warmth to calculating assessment of this union between established wealth and ambitious journalism. But her attention was captured entirely by Edward, waiting at the altar in perfectly tailored morning dress, his grey eyes fixed on her with an expression of wonder and gratitude that made her heart race. His injured arm had healed completely, allowing him to stand with perfect posture while receiving the woman who had transformed from business arrangement to beloved partner. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of ancient words and solemn promises, with Kate and Edward speaking their vows in voices clear enough to carry throughout the sanctuary. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Edward's kiss was both tender and triumphant, sealing not just their marriage, but the completion of a journey that had begun with deception and arrived at absolute truth. The wedding reception at the Whitmore mansion transformed the Fifth Avenue residence into a fairy tale setting. Crystal chandeliers cast rainbow prisms across walls, draped with silk and decorated with thousands of white roses and baby's breath. A 12-piece orchestra from Vienna provided music for dancing, while staff in formal livery served champagne and delicacies that rivaled the finest European hotels. Kate moved through the receiving line with practiced grace, accepting congratulations from guests whose names read like a directory of American power and influence. The Astors expressed warm approval, the Vanderbilts offered polite good wishes despite their business rivalry with Edward, and the Carnegies engaged in animated discussion about Kate's writing projects. "Mrs. Whitmore," said Mrs. Caroline Astor, the undisputed queen of New York society, "I hope you'll continue your journalistic endeavors. It's refreshing to see a young woman with both beauty and intellect." The endorsement from Mrs. Astor was worth more than any newspaper review, effectively guaranteeing Kate's continued acceptance in the highest social circles, regardless of her unconventional career. As evening approached, Edward led Kate onto the dance floor for their first waltz as a married couple. The orchestra played Strauss's Emperor Waltz, while guests formed a circle around them, but Kate was conscious only of Edward's hand at her waist and the expression of complete contentment on his face. "Any regrets?" Edward murmured as they turned through the complicated steps. "Only that we waited so long to be honest about our feelings," Kate replied, "and perhaps that we won't have time for a proper honeymoon with all your business obligations." Edward's smile was mysterious. "About that, I've arranged for Thompson to handle daily operations for the next month. We're taking the private car to San Francisco, then sailing to Hawaii. I thought you might enjoy seeing the Western territories you've been writing about." Kate's delighted laughter drew smiles from the watching guests, who interpreted her obvious joy as the proper response of a new bride to her husband's generosity. As the evening progressed, Kate found herself reflecting on the remarkable journey that had brought her to this moment. What had begun as a simple business arrangement had evolved through attraction, conflict, investigation, and near tragedy to arrive at genuine love and partnership. The road had been neither straight nor simple, but it had led to something far more valuable than either had originally sought. The wedding guests gradually departed into the warm June night, leaving behind a mansion filled with flowers and the lingering music of celebration. Kate and Edward stood on the terrace overlooking the garden, her train carefully arranged to avoid the stone steps, while his arm encircled her waist with possessive tenderness. "So, Mrs. Whitmore," Edward said, testing the sound of her new name, "what shall we do with our new life together?" Kate leaned against his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of his body and the steady rhythm of his breathing. "Build something beautiful," she replied simply, "something that honors both tradition and progress, wealth and responsibility, love and truth. As fireworks began exploding over the East River, Edward's final surprise for their wedding celebration, Kate realized that their story was really just beginning. Whatever challenges lay ahead in their life together, they would face them as true partners who had learned that the deepest connections grew not from deception, but from the courage to reveal one's authentic self to another person worthy of such trust. The golden age was theirs to shape, and they would shape it together.